Welcome back to our series of looking to get clean and looking to deal with the issues in our life that have been causing us pain by working through the Beatitudes. And in our last session we were looking at blessed are the pure in heart, and how that process of getting clean involves confession, of identifying what the issues are to allow us to begin to get clean. And I wonder how you're feeling. It may be that at this moment you're ready to start throwing things at me, that you're starting to get angry, that actually, I had my life together and everything was fine, and now you're taking the lid off the Pandora's box. I'm starting to feel things that I thought I dealt with years ago. I'm starting to have to look at things I never wanted to look at again. If you're feeling those things, I want to suggest to you that this is perfectly normal at this point. Let's go back to the Kubler-Ross grief cycle that we looked at in our second session. And remember that there's a process of putting things to death. There's a process where we mourn. There's a process where we allow things to die, and we go through this process. And on that process there's a number of different stages. Stages where we feel frozen, stages where we're in denial, but also stages where we're in anger. We get angry, or we start to bargain and try to justify what we do. And maybe as a result of the last session, you want to look at this diagram again and go, actually some of what I'm feeling, actually I can see that's part of this process. And if you're on that process, I want to encourage you, don't give up. Keep going, because at the end of the process, there is an adventure ahead of you that is one that your freedom will allow you to experience and enjoy life to the full. Today's principle is, another one of the Beatitudes that says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And the emphasis in this Beatitude is actually coming back to something that we talked about in a previous session, where we used the word righteousness. Righteousness literally means it's the result of getting clean. And it literally means having a right standing, being whole or being right. And so blessed are those who are hungry and thirsty for a right standing. Blessed are those who are hungry and thirsty for being whole. And the promise is that if we do that, then we will be filled, we will be satisfied. When you hunger and thirst for something, it speaks of having an earnest desire. We eagerly desire something. We're chasing after something. And the process we've been on is recognising what the issue is. And that's just the start of the process. We have to be willing to do something about it. Now we're getting to the point of being hungry to deal with it and hungry to do something about it. If we come back to our cycle of change, we find ourselves at the response stage, where we've taken action and we've formed an inventory, and we've started to take an honest look at what the issues are, and we've started to get to this point of being willing to do something about it and knowing what it is that we need to do. To turn that action into a response, to turn that action into movement, we have to ask ourselves the question, or whether the pain of staying where we are is greater than the pain of moving forward. Because when the pain of staying where we are is greater than the pain of moving into something new, then momentum happens, because we move towards the place of least pain. And the response stage of our cycle of change is where we recognise our decision to start to take responsibility. There are always barriers to each thing that we face in life. And as we come to this question of taking responsibility, there are a number of barriers to taking responsibility. And let's not forget that often we're dealing with long-standing, deeply ingrained behaviours, deeply ingrained beliefs, or deeply ingrained pains that we have carried, hurts that we've carried for years that are genuine pains. And in doing this process, I'm not seeking to minimise the pain of what's happened to you. I don't in any way want to dismiss or make light of it, or in any way suggest that what you went through isn't important, because it is. But often what we find is that the things that we've had, the challenge of taking responsibility is because we're stuck with sort of a negative response cycle that we've been through. And to help us look at some of the barriers, I want us to understand what I'm going to call the negative response compass. When we have these false beliefs, these unhealthy coping mechanisms, these character defects, often they manifest themselves by appearing in different ways, that we respond in different ways. And the responses that we have, that we're seeking to be free from, are often negative responses. And when we look at our responsibility compass, our response compass, what we see is that there are often four things that happen, that our experience produces a response where we choose to withdraw. And our way of coping with a situation is withdrawal, where we isolate, we don't engage, we run away, we find ourselves hiding from the issue. You know, if I don't face it, if I say it's not there, then it will go away. It's a bit like sticking the ostrich sticking the head in the sand. Problem is, it leaves a big backside exposed. The opposite to withdraw in some ways is avoidance. That just as withdrawal is about not engaging, avoidance is actually about finding other ways to not face it. So that might be denial, where we allow denial to live, and we've lived with that for years, where we've basically said, if I don't acknowledge that it's there, I allow the elephant in the room to remain, then I'm going to be safe. But this stage can also mean that we start to try to escape into a false reality, where we maybe have an addiction to try to cover up what we're feeling. I share some of my own journey with food, where food became a comfort for me to replace things, emotions and feelings that I wasn't feeling. We might find ourselves trying to be distracted by, doing other things so that we don't have to think about it. And we start to live in a false reality and escapism. Or we go the other way, where we avoid it by going into sort of harmful behaviours. We display risky behaviours in order to try and drown out the noise. But there's also sometimes where, if those are some sort of passive reactions, we can sometimes have some active reactions. One is that we might start to attack others. Oh, I don't attack others. Well, no, sometimes some people will physically attack someone. But attack can come in different forms. We can actually blame the victim, blame the other person. It was their fault that I feel this way. We can find ourselves criticising the other person. If only they weren't that, if only they weren't this. I'm where I am because of what that person's done. Or maybe we end up with wanting to take revenge against that person. All those things are forms of attacking somebody else. But if we don't do that, the other risk is that we find ourselves attacking ourselves, where we constantly put ourselves down, our self-esteem shot to bits, we put ourselves down, we don't value ourselves, we end up trying to keep everybody happy all the time at a cost to ourselves. We can end up as I've already shared with myself, maybe eating disorders start to come in, where we start to harm ourselves. Or worse still, we can find ourselves in a place where we're self-harming, because the way that we cope with the situation is we have a negative response, where if I harm myself, I've actually got control. I'm feeling something that I don't normally feel, or it's the one thing that I've got control over. All these things are negative responses that we can have to a situation that's ingrained in the result of that negative belief. And the barriers to take responsibility for these things are that maybe we're stuck in what we could call a sin-confess cycle. We've tried it and we've failed it before. We've tried something and we come to God and we go, God, I'm sorry, but then we go back and we do it again. Maybe we're dealing with a genuine addictive habit. We've got a faulty coping mechanism that we're aware of, or we're actually unaware of. That might be substance misuse, alcohol, prescription medication. It might be an eating disorder. It might be pornography. Whatever that addictive behaviour is, it's a faulty coping mechanism that we use, and it's a genuine addiction that we need to break the power of. Maybe the truth is we're actually quite happy with our pleasure, the pleasure we get from the faulty mechanism. At the end of the day, sin wouldn't be attractive if it wasn't pleasurable. That sense of the first time you get drunk, you might go, actually this is an enjoyable experience, but then you wake up in the morning with a hangover and go, why did I do what I do? But when one drink becomes 2 drinks, it becomes 4 drinks, it becomes something that you do every night. What was originally something that was giving us pleasure actually becomes something that's harming us. But we enjoy it, so we decide we're going to keep doing it. Maybe we feel overwhelmed, we just don't know where to start. And with all of these things, with this negative response compass, we have to start to learn to respond in a different way. These responses are rooted in our faulty coping mechanisms, in our false beliefs, and our behaviours are rooted in these learned behaviours that we developed to protect ourselves. That suit of armour we put on to protect ourselves as a small person no longer works in a big world. And the invitation is, it's time for us to stop living life looking in the rear view mirror at where we've been, and to start looking at where we want to go. We are asking ourselves the question of how we can begin to break these faulty belief cycles, these faulty coping mechanisms. And I want us to think about the sort of purpose of looking at this is because some of these things in us go deep. And I want us to use what I'm going to call the dandelion challenge. If you've got a garden of any description, be that a backyard that's 2 by 2, or it's a garden that's got several acres, I bet somewhere within there's dandelions. And if, like me, you've gone along and you've mowed the grass and you've mowed the heads off the dandelions, when you come back to cut the grass the following week, the dandelions are back. The heads have come back. And the reality is, unless you remove the root, they will grow back. And the only way we can get rid of the dandelions is to dig out the roots. But when we dig out the roots, certainly in my lawn, I don't know whether I'm doing it wrong, but I end up with big holes left in my lawn that need to be filled and repaired. And that's the purpose of this stage. That's the purpose of what we're doing. Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, talks about being transformed by the renewing of your mind. And many years ago, I learned that the root Greek word for being transformed is the word metamorphosis. And in my head, I often think that our minds need to go through that metamorphosis process that a butterfly goes through, where it goes from a caterpillar to a butterfly by going through this cocoon, this metamorphosis stage, where everything turns to mush and is completely redeveloped. And what we're doing in this stage of looking at our faulty coping mechanisms is going through this metamorphosis stage where we're willing to face up to the denial, we're willing to begin to put things to death, we're starting to draw on the strength of God rather than our own willpower, and we've now made a list where we've identified what the issues are that we've been experiencing, and we're starting to evaluate that list and look at it. And we're coming to a place where we're willing to start to release control. And I want to invite you to look at your list and to pick the biggest issue on the list. Maybe it was the first thing that came to mind, but as you've looked through the list, you said, yeah, that's the one that really is the one that's painful. And I want to invite you to start to work from that secure spiritual platform that we've been building, being connected to God and taking God at his word. Remember, he says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. We don't do this in our strength, we do this in God's strength. We found a safe place, we found some safe people, and with those things in place we can now begin to dig out the roots. We can begin to gain a true perspective of the situation and stop looking at things through rose-tinted glasses, but actually start to look at them honestly and say, yeah, actually, I do need to deal with that because it is causing me these things. And now we can see it in black and white. We can begin to confess these things and become honest with them and start to, as we bring them out into the light, confessing them, we can begin to break the hold that they have in our lives. How do we begin to do that? How do we begin to break the power of these faulty coping mechanisms? I want to suggest that we need to use a technique that we call the responsibility pie. How do we do this? Well, what I want you to do is I want you to draw a circle on your sheet of paper and then draw a line from 12 o'clock to the centre of your circle. What I then want you to do is to pick one of the items on your list that you want to work through, that you want to confess and you want to get honest about. And evaluate that issue and look at every contributory factor to that issue. So maybe, for example, you're looking at, let's use the example of a car crash. You've had a car crash and that car crash caused somebody that you love to be injured. And you've been carrying the guilt of that for years because you were driving. What I want you to do is to take that incident and start to write down all the factors that were involved. Okay, maybe it was raining. Maybe that somebody swerved in front of you. Whatever it is, sit down and take some time to put every contributory factor to that incident down on a sheet of paper. But put yourself last on that. When you've got a full list and you've thought of everything that possibly could have contributed to the incident that you had, I then want you to start allocating a responsibility to each part. So, how much did the rain play a factor in the car crash? 50% because the roads were slippery. It's important that we're taking a balanced approach here, but we start to allocate a responsibility to each of those contributory factors. And when you've done that, I want you to start drawing those onto your pie, so that what you start to do is to build up a picture of who's responsible for what. When this is done honestly, what we find is that we do not have a full responsibility for what happened. And I've seen people do this, and when we've done this in recovery processes, where someone's actually come to the realisation that what happened to me was not my fault. I think particularly when we've worked with people who've been the victims of abuse, this is particularly powerful when we realise how little control we had over the situation of what was done to us. But we've been carrying an unhealthy responsibility for our part in that process for so many years. And when we look at our responsibility pie and we start to realise that actually I had only a very small part to play in, so there were many things that were outside of my control, we can start to get a balanced perspective of the issue and maybe realise that we've been carrying with us for too many years the pain of something that wasn't our responsibility. What we need to do now is to confess our part. Having done an inventory and identified the issues and looked at recurring patterns and how they'd impacted us and the work we did in our last stage, and now taking each one of those and evaluating those further and looking at our responsibility, we can start to acknowledge what was our responsibility but also what was not our responsibility. And as we confess that, we can start to take responsibility for the bit that was ours and let go of holding on to that part that wasn't ours. And we can at this point invite Holy Spirit to remove the character defect and remove the false belief that we've created about that thing that we went through. I said before about taking God at his word, and one of the most influential verses in my life has been John 8:32, where Jesus said, "Know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And in my experience, when we do this process of getting honest and confessing and honestly evaluating it and looking at it properly with a balanced perspective, it's one of those light bulb moments where suddenly I've seen people do this and start crying out, "It wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault. We've believed for years that we were responsible for that issue, but actually we weren't." Sometimes we have that light bulb moment where it's the opposite way round, where we realise that actually the pain that we've been carrying, the behaviour or the habit that we've had for years, has been impacting on other people. And that light bulb moment works the opposite way round, where we suddenly realise that we need to take responsibility for something that we haven't taken responsibility for. The power of this passage is know the truth, and the truth will set you free. As we journey through this process, what we start to realise is getting clean begins when we get honest, but deepens when we get specific. And as we take responsibility for our part and stop taking responsibility for what wasn't our part, the power of that situation, the power of that false belief and how it's influencing our life today is broken, and we start to discover a whole new freedom. Our principle from the Beatitude is, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." When we are hungry enough to release our grip on what we've been holding and let God have what we've been holding, when we start to get a true perspective on the situation and confess our part and take responsibility for our part, we break the power of that. When we truly hunger and thirst for a right standing, the promise is that we will be satisfied. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. If you genuinely start to really hunger after being right and work through this process of getting clean, you will start to discover your breakthrough. Breakthrough comes when we take responsibility for what we are responsible for and stop carrying what is not ours to carry. Remember, Jesus' death on the cross broke the power of sin and death. He broke the power of sin to continue to hurt you. And when you bring that out into the light and you confess it and you stop carrying it, instead of you carrying it, it gets nailed to the cross. It's almost like Jesus is holding that on the cross and saying, "This is why I died. I died to put your issue to death so that you can have life and no longer need to carry it." The invitation is for us to now confess, take responsibility, and allow our recovery, allow our breakthrough to begin.